That's what I want to hear.
That's the way I work. It's beautiful.
All right. Welcome everybody to the second Thursday of the month. We're going to be going over intermediate camera knowledge today. I'll give everybody a few minutes to jump online here, but I have 4 students in front of me today, so I do have a mix of online and in person. Same as last week, we'll mainly be going through the slides that you see on the screen, on your screen here. And then from there, I'll answer questions at the end. We'll try to go through for about an hour for the presentation. Last 30 minutes, we'll open it up to questions. You guys can comment in the chat on the screen, and then obviously my students in front of me will comment as they feel fit. Anybody who can make it in, we do the classes in person from 5:30 to 7 Thursdays, the first, second, and last Thursday of every month. First Thursday is camera basics, second Thursday is intermediate, and the final Thursday is our GoPro and action cameras. So yeah, give it a couple more minutes, get some more viewers on here, and then we'll jump into the presentation. If you guys have any questions in the meantime, please comment in the chat. But today's class is mainly going to focus on a few things. The 2 most important things we're going to focus on is lenses, what we consider the trinity or the holy necessity of lenses. And then the second thing we'll talk about is the exposure triangle. So looking at aperture, ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed, all in the same realm, especially now if you're graduating from using automatic to going into a manual control or a controlled aperture or controlled aperture f-stop. So a couple more minutes, we'll get started.
You mean I could have been sitting at home watching this?
That's nice, yeah.
Yeah, but you wanted to see me, admit it. We're old friends from the old neighborhood in Chicago. It's been years.
That wax Malganco was brutal. I didn't see I could have stayed home and done this.
How far did you travel to get here?
10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And then it's not bad.
And yourself, how far?
Malganco.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
And this young lady?
Like a line.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like a line.
That's not big problem.
Well, I apologize no one told you that they were online.
No worries.
The online stuff, it's nice. So far, it's been okay. We've had, I think last time was my most viewers. I had 5 people in front of me that day, or 6 people we had last class, and then we had about 14 viewers at the same time. So about 20
You had
people
14
technically.
viewers last
Yeah.
night?
They tell me in the little top corner up there. I can see exactly
3.
how many. Yeah. So right now we have 3 people who are who are watching
From
yeah.
Chicago.
Two tree.
Tree.
But yeah, so far we'll see. We'll see how this keeps going. There's talks of doing it different ways, but this seems to be one of the better ways that we've come to, and especially with everybody here in the store. We did them for so long in person, and they were doing really well. And then once the pandemic broke out, people's comfortability and how they feel with public, you know, and especially being in an enclosed space, multiple people around, some people just don't still feel comfortable with that. So this is a nice alternative. It gives people the ability to
That's
see everything.
Isn't it?
whatnot.
Look at that.
It's a little blurry.
Okay, still.
Doesn't that drive you nuts? Why did I buy this?
Exactly.
There's got to be something better about this than that phone. Has to be.
You're getting there. You just have to learn. We just got to keep playing with all the settings.
That's what I want to do.
And we're gonna.
I want to be able to get that one shot where you have the head and it just everything else is full.
Mirrorless camera or regular camera?
DSLR.
Yeah.
You have to go with the mirrorless one.
It might be a time to upgrade, but
Upgrade.
Yeah.
no.
That's what I did. I saw the old one in eBay and get the mirrorless. Much better. It's the quality.
See? That's what I said. I should have got a mirrorless instead.
This is not mirrorless.
It is not.
That's the one.
All right. Well, let's jump in, and then we can talk more about this on the end. But intermediate camera knowledge, starting from the first slide. So why go advanced from point and shoot, DSLR, or mirrorless? So this is the conversation that we were just having prior. Why do you think you should go from a point and shoot, or why should you go from a phone to one of these? These are the other options.
Yeah, that helps.
The idea with them is that by upgrading from a phone, you're getting a camera that has a better megapixel sensor, so it's going to take a sharper image that if you zoom into it or you crop, you'll have more information that the camera is reading better than the phone can. You have a camera that has better control over your lighting. The noise of the image, the motion of the image, or the subject matter. The control overall on a camera versus a phone is much greater. No matter how good they've made these phone cameras, there's still a lot that the camera itself can do that the phone just can't. And control is the biggest thing, and that's what we talk about mainly in here, is having more advanced control over your camera, having better control than, let's say, a phone. So snapshots versus photographs. I like to use this as my example of a snapshot. Anybody who's been into the store here at Apple Electronics, we have 2 escalators that go up from the atrium. If you go on this escalator, on the other side, you get a really cool view of all these Chicago skyscrapers kind of arching overhead. This was done on an iPhone, I want to say 12 Pro, so fairly new iPhone. This was done on one of the newer DSLR cameras. Huge difference. So when we talk about taking a snapshot versus a photograph, what we're really talking about is the way that a photograph is meant to be lined up and the way that a photograph is meant to be taken. With a snapshot, it's a quick image. If you're walking around somewhere and you have your phone with you, it'll take a good image, and someone said it earlier, it's great for Facebook, it's great for social media.
I'm watching you live.
You're watching me live right now? No kidding.
It's a little delayed.
A little delayed. Thanks, John. John poking his head in, giving a little feedback. Appreciate it. The big difference between something that's a snapshot and a photograph is simple. It's the idea that when you're taking a snapshot, it's a quick image. It's not meant to be perfect, not meant to be thought out. It's meant to just be a quick, simple image. As you move into an actual photograph, that's where you get the detail. And with this image, definitely the color was altered a little bit on this to make everything a little more vibrant and pop. But as far as the actual glare coming off of the escalator sides, that shine, that reflection from the center, the lighting itself, everything else, that was already on the image. That was stuff that we were able to have there. The color, that bright blue sky, the brilliancy of the purple on the railings, that is all something that can be edited with hue and saturation. And we talked a little bit about photo editing last time. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. That's in the beginning of this. But it's important to remember that with a phone, it's more of a snapshot. You can take more methodical pictures with it, but to really truly get the complexities of something, a camera is what is going to pick up those complexities, those more advanced nuances that make photography so interesting. So step 1, and we talked about this in the last class, but the biggest thing is always learn your camera. That's what these courses are meant for. But I use this image because there are so many different cameras. I doubled up on the Sony side to keep it even. But if you go from Nikon to Sony to Canon, there's not just one camera that they make. They make multiple of them. They make everything from DSLR to mirrorless to point and shoot. Sony's the unique one. They only make mirrorless and point and shoot models. They do not have any DSLRs. Technically, Sony is the first one to really bring mirrorless to the forefront. When they introduced their cameras, they were all mirrorless, and from then on, they've only used the one mount, which is the E-mount. Also makes it really nice with Sony if you want to upgrade your lenses. But it's really important to make sure that you know the camera that you have, understand the style of the camera that you have, and then know the little features of it. ISO, what its frames per second will be, what it can shoot as far as video, 4K or just 1080. Megapixels are always huge with cameras. It's important to remember that. And Google Haas says hi. Hi, Google Haas. So JPEG or RAW. Now this moves into more of an understanding of the image. So you have a JPEG or a RAW file. JPEG and RAW are 2 different ways that you can shoot, and some cameras, more advanced cameras, will give you the option to do both, where you can do JPEG and RAW. RAW files have more information embedded within the photo file. So if you take that into a thing like Adobe Photoshop, or if you have another photo editing software that you have much more that you can manipulate on the raw photo to make it better. Typically the colors are a little bit more muted, but you have more color control in those editing features and softwares than you will on a JPEG. And the JPEG, on the right side of it, you can kind of see the JPEG has more color. The shirt on him is a little bit darker. You can see the skin tones on his arm where it's bending are a little bit more complex. The The guitar isn't as washed out. The JPEG itself is going to give that quality. But then if you look next to it, a process raw, so that's a photo that was gone through the process. Someone had taken that, edited the photo, and manipulated it to be better as far as the color is concerned. You can see the sharpness, especially on his arm. That's what I'm drawn to the most, where the fold is. You can see how rosy his arm is on the outside. And when you look at the JPEG, you can see it's a little bit more washed out with that background light. Raw photos are easier to manipulate and edit, but if you're someone who is just trying to get a clean image the first time, maybe change the color slightly on there, but you're really not trying to do the heavy legwork that Photoshop allows for, a JPEG is pretty standard and pretty good for everybody. But a process raw could be that extra push that you need to give your photos a little bit more. And if you're technically savvy and you like editing, then definitely shooting in RAW would be a better option than shooting in JPEG. And then editing softwares, again, Photoshop is a big one. I forgot what that middle one was. I just was reading about it the other day. That's why I pulled it up. And then there's another one on the right there. That is a video editing software, but can also be used for photos. Finding an editing software that that's it. So it's Photoshop. The middle one is Microsoft's editing system, which is their free one. And then I believe the top one is Apple, but I could be wrong on that Apple one up there. I think it says it on the one image.
That's the iMovie or?
That's definitely not iMovie. I know that's not iMovie. No, that's why, yeah, that's definitely not Apple. I forgot what I put on the top corner up there. Photoshop and the Microsoft one are two really popular ones. I know that you can edit photos on the Apple computer too. If you simply open the photo, go to Finder, they can open up, and it's usually a more simple one. You can change color, hue, saturation, curves, and then the exposure of the photo typically.
Canon has a favorite Canon digital professional.
I think that's it right there.
Yeah.
Yes.
What is it?
It's the Canon's app. So Canon has it where you can do the free software.
You can download.
Oh, Jack Computers. That is DaVinci Resolve. That's it. It's DaVinci. And I was reading about the software. I personally have not used DaVinci, but it's a pretty easy to use. And from what I understand too, they offer a lot of different classes that are on there and videos on how to edit and do everything too. So it's a tool to edit, and then it's also a tool to learn while you're editing or in the process of it. I've had many people that have used that. They've told me about it.
DaVinci or?
DaVinci is what it's called. I am more focused on Adobe. I've used the Photoshop. I've used InDesign. I've used all the different aspects of Adobe. I like them a lot. Plus with the Creative Cloud too, you can store the photos on there. It acts as an iCloud or a cloud-based storage. Helps you keep everything saved on one spot. The mode dial. We're touching base on everything that we talked about in an earlier class last Thursday. That was the intro, where we talked about the things that you need to kind of understand before you deep dive into everything else. The mode dial on everybody's camera is a big one. This is where you'll be able to go through your settings. We tried last week to kind of graduate from auto. Learn a little bit more about what auto can do, and then learn about more what manual, the aperture priority, your shutter speed priority, and then even the custom ones can do. And when you get into a camera like, I believe that would be the Canon mode dial on the left there, this guy right there, that is where you get more of those, or sorry, I believe, yeah, that's the Canon one. That's where you have extra features as far as something that's moving, a portrait style, nighttime shooting, landscape, and then close-up photography. So they give you scenes or specialty shooting. But it's important to remember what the mode dials do and then be comfortable with using it. Going back into it with the mode dials, the main ones you'll see on there, unless you have the scenes option like the Nikon does, or like I believe Canon does as
Canon
well.
does that.
Yeah, Canon has those on there. I know Sony doesn't. You have automatic, program auto, aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual. Full manual, that's the M symbol on there. You have all the control you could ever want. That's where you are setting everything. You're doing it by hand. You're actually going through the camera settings, and based on what your light meter says and then your environment, you are changing the settings on there to fit your needs, to get the color, to get the graininess that you want, to get the specific exposure that you want for the subject. Shutter priority gives priority to the speed of the shutter. And we'll go over exactly what shutter helps and doesn't help with, but overall, if you're trying to get something that's moving at a fast rate, you play with the shutter speed in order to make sure that you're getting it and getting the image as still or as blurry as possible, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Aperture priority, similar, that I would say aperture involves more of light. You're setting the aperture in to allow for the iris of the camera to be opened at a certain rate, whether that's a smaller or a larger size. Typically within doing that, it helps with image, what's in your focal length. So if you're doing something that's close up versus doing something that's further away, setting your aperture in response to that is important. Program auto, the P on the camera, typically with the mode dial, that's where you're actually setting the program. That's where you can choose what you want the settings to be. Every time you go to the P, it'll stay on that one. So you can do auto, you can do it where you're just controlling aperture, or you can do it where it almost acts as a secondary manual. You can control whatever you want. And then automatic, pretty self-explanatory. That gives you auto features on the camera, does everything for you. All you got to do is point and shoot. So I talked a little bit about it before, but this is the main thing that we're going to be getting into before lenses, the exposure triangle. So we went over what we went over last week a little bit, going through mode, going through cloud-based solution, editing softwares, talked a little bit about what a snapshot and a photograph is, but now we can start breaking down the nitty-gritty, the more controlled things of the camera. So starting with aperture.
So if I go to aperture now, I could get this.
So with this, you won't see this on there, but this breaks down what those numbers when you're looking at aperture means. So if you go to, for you, flip it back over, that is the A, yes, that is aperture priority. When you're setting it, it should be up there with that dial there. As you turn that dial, that number changes.
Right.
So with the aperture, it's the iris of the camera. So it's the little eye, the little pinhole that's on there. And those shutters that are on there are those, there's another term for them, I forget the name, wings, not wings, but basically the shutters move in a way where it makes the iris of the camera smaller or it makes it larger. Typically, the bigger the f-stop, the more in detail you can get subject matter that's closer to you. So on the bottom end of that, the larger the aperture, you can see that in the little diagram, the figure in the front and the foreground is clear and the background starts to become hazy. And as you keep changing that f-stop, also, the funny thing with f-stop, and it's the only one that's like that, is that numbers go backwards. The bigger the aperture, or the bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. The larger, or the smaller the number, the larger the aperture. A lot of people get confused with that. But with aperture, having a smaller one will keep more subject matters in close. Having a larger aperture will keep whatever's in your foreground at the kind of the center of your photo, and it'll start to blur out the background. And we'll see some examples of that in a little bit here. Shutter, that's the speed of which the camera is closing its shutter. So when you look, the 1/1000th all the way down to a half. So easiest way to think about that is how fast it's going to be closing within the second. So I'm terrible at math here, but 1 1,000ths is going to be kind of like the sweet spot if you're trying to capture something in motion. You have a runner, you have a biker, birds, anything that you're getting in motion, that 1 to 1,000 range would be kind of where you want to keep it. It's going to give you a nice slowed down frame by frame image, but then what's nice about it is it should, depending on what your aperture is, which if you're on shutter priority, the only thing you have to focus on is your shutter speed, and if you're on aperture, the only thing you have to focus on is your aperture priority. If you're using both of them together in a manual sense, knowing what your subject matter is, whether that is a person or a landscape, how far their distance in between each other is, what the speed of that is, which would then affect shutter, and then looking at aperture again, what exactly are you trying to get in the image? Are you trying to keep the background, the foreground and the background together, or are you trying to separate the two, keep the foreground in better focus and the background more blurred, or vice versa? You have those options. Shutter speed, that'll control the speed of which the camera's shutting and capturing the image. Again, the higher the number for this, the faster it's going to close. The smaller the number, the slower it'll close. If you don't have something in motion, or you don't have a lot of motion, it's important to keep the shutter lower. And the reason being is there's more detail, more information that can be picked up by the shutter if it's kept at a lower number. Now, however, if you keep it at a slower shutter speed, it will cause, if the image moves or the subject moves even in the slightest bit, you'll get blur. You'll get some form of motion. You'll get something that doesn't necessarily look right. A lot of the times, if you're using a lower shutter speed, you might also consider a tripod, or if you have a camera strap on, you might want to make sure that that's nice and taut around the neck while you're shooting so you don't get a lot of movement.
What's the advantage of a lower shutter speed?
Lower shutter speed's better image quality, so you get a sharper image with it. But the toughest part with having a lower one is that if what you're taking moves, then that's where you get the blurriness. So if you're doing a still, like if you were taking a picture of just your lens right now that you have out there,
Or a flower.
exactly, flower,
With no wind.
no wind, I would say you'd want to get a nice wide f-stop, so 1.4, 2, 2.8, something where the background itself is blurred out, and then you're keeping a lower shutter speed, so that way you're able to get all the complexities of that, keep the background out of focus, and just focus in on the flower.
So my question is, as I move this, how would I do that on here? Just curious.
Which one?
Okay, first of all, I'm on the shutter speed, so
Mhm.
I can move the shutter speed anywhere I want.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but this changes as well.
Yeah, because you're on shutter priority, so it's only
Where's
focusing.
the priority?
You're right here. So these are your mode. Remember the mode dial we talked
but
about last week?
Doesn't that match that?
So it matches the line. So shutter.
Yeah, I'm not on priority.
Well, that's program. P is program. That's the one that
Okay.
you program yourself. This is considered your dial. Anything you have on the dial that's its priority. So if you have manual becomes your main priority that the camera is focusing on.
So in order to do this, would I have to have it on manual?
Well, if you want to control both at the same time, then yes. You would
Okay,
have
that's
it.
what I was, yeah.
Yep.
So now each of these have,
Yep. So both dials should give you different control.
all right, so I wasn't getting that when I was doing just the shutter, or the
Yeah.
aperture, or, yeah, the shutter.
And that goes into what we talked about last week with it. If you're taking something where there's a lot of motion, you don't necessarily need to be focused on the background or the foreground having more priority than one or the other. I would say keep it on your shutter priority, focus on the speed of the camera, and focus on the speed of your objects to get the best photos. On the flip side, if you have subjects or a photo shoot where you don't necessarily want to get the background, or you do want to incorporate the background on certain pictures, setting it to the aperture priority and letting the camera decide what the shutter speed needs to be at would be better for that. It always depends on what you're shooting.
So the aperture is a little bit like the auto, as far as
In a
speed.
way, but the auto gives you the auto controls everything.
Everything, right,
Yeah,
right.
you don't even need to think twice. You point and shoot, or just point that camera, take the picture.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
You're okay. And then ISO. ISO is going to be the light that the camera lets in, but it's also the camera's sensitivity and sensitivity towards light. As you move into higher ISOs, you're going to get a much more grainy image. A lot of people do like the grainier images. It lends itself to be closer to film photography, gives it a certain vignette. It has a vintage feel to it. There's a lot of fun you can have with ISO. The lower the ISO, the lower its sensitivity is to light. So typically, you want to go higher ISO when you're in darker situations. The higher the ISO number, the better you are, because the camera's sensitivity, or the camera's main function, is to focus on the sensitivity of the light that's in the area. When you have a lower sensitivity number or a lower ISO number, your camera's less focused on that. Light in the area is good. The camera's main focus then comes down to the shutter and the aperture, which if you're in full manual, those are when you can have the controls over it. For the most part, when you're using your aperture priority or your shutter priority, you still do have control over ISO, and you can dictate what you want the ISO to be.
How do I do that? Curious.
So that would be, if we're using this guy,
That should be dialed.
it should be, there's that, there's this,
Yeah.
and then there's my last guy.
Yeah, that's what I couldn't find the last one.
I think mine's under manual.
I am,
I think mine might be just automatically puts it where it wants it.
Cute. This guy.
Cute.
That's what I was trying to do.
It's one of these buttons.
Well, you finish with your class, we'll figure it out later, I guess.
We'll take a look at the end and figure out how you
Yeah.
switch that.
Thanks.
But yeah, that is something that you can control. So that's a more in-depth, or that's a overarching kind of look at it. Let's now break it down a little bit more, and we'll break down further. If anyone needs to take a picture of this guy or wants to grab a snapshot of it, by all means. I'm going to move on to the next slide in a second here.
Let me ask a question.
Yeah.
What's the difference, we're going back a little,
Mm-hmm.
what's the difference between program and manual?
Program you can set yourself. So manual will constantly, it won't go back to where it was before. When you open up the manual setting, it's going to be wherever it takes off from. So sometimes if you're coming from aperture, when you go back to manual, it'll take the aperture settings that you just had, move it to manual, and then you can control and set. Program allows you to set certain things. So if you want your ISO to always be auto, you can have that, and then you can focus on everything else.
Oh.
In the program, if you want to just set shutter speed and then control everything else, you can do that. If you have certain autofocus methods that you want, or other certain like personal preferences within the camera that you'd like, you can set that to the P.
Okay, thanks, that's really good.
So let's break down aperture a little more again. So just what we were talking about with aperture, when you have a lower aperture number, the iris is going to be fully open, and with that it's going to keep subjects in the foreground at the main center of attention, and then it's going to move the focus on just them while blurring everything else out. As you raise that f-stop number and you make the iris smaller, the camera is then going to be able to get both the foreground and the background and reduce the amount of blur or motion in between. Some examples that I have of that would be these guys. So when we look at the squirrel, we can definitely tell that it was done on an aperture. I wouldn't say it's 1.4. I probably
Yeah,
would
that's what I
say
wanted, yeah.
it's like a 2.8 or a 3.6. You can see there's some more information on the log underneath the squirrel, so you can tell that it wasn't just the foreground, or just wasn't the main figure. There's a little bit more to it. Same thing with the dog. If we look at the nose, we see a lot of detail on the nose, we see the detail on the fur, but we can still clearly make out the guy in the background. So we know that there are two dogs, whereas with the squirrel, we have a heavy blur on the background. I'm sure that that's foliage, trees, everything else, but you really can't tell. Versus with the dogs, you know right away that there's one dog in front, one dog behind. And all the detail and everything is on the main foreground. So the dog's nose in the foreground of our left photo, and the squirrel, and it looks like his nut, on the right photo. And this is something that aperture would give us control over. Another great example, Mr. Emmett. The Lego guy in the center there, Emmett, he is in focus. Our background is heavily blurred. It could be something's behind him, or it could just be that the artist put a bunch of little lights behind him just to give the figure a little bit more illumination. Funny enough, too, these photos don't necessarily go into it with the rule of thirds, but this one definitely does. I know we talked about the rule of thirds in composition building last week, but if you were to take a photo and break it into 3 different quadrants, this would technically lie between the center quadrant and the last quadrant, which again makes a more pleasing view or picture to the eye. So why use aperture priority mode? Using aperture priority mode gives you control over your subject, so your foreground, and control over your background. Importance of that could be if you're taking a photo of just the family, it's a nice shot, you're not concerned about the landscape or the view, you're not on any sort of vacation, this might just be your holiday Christmas card. Using a lower aperture will give you a full iris, which will keep the family and everybody else in focus and blur your background out, so that way the main subject or the main thing that you're taking the photo of is the family. Opening up that or closing that aperture, making the number higher, would give you something closer to this image where she's still in focus, but you can clearly make out the background behind her with only a slight amount of blur. There's still blur if you look in the background towards the end of the island. You can see more motion and a little less clarity. But as you start moving into the foreground with her, the rocks behind her where the water meets the sand starts to clear up. The rocks and the moss behind her start to clear up. And then obviously the rocks underneath her feet as she's standing there are all clear. So using aperture priority is important depending on what you're trying to capture as far as your background and your subject matter are concerned. So background versus foreground is the main priority of aperture. And then another review. This one gives a little bit more clarity towards what we were talking about. So you can see the log is clear in all the photos, but as you raise that number up, the background becomes more and more clear. I like to joke that f2.8, if you were using that and this was the photo you were trying to sell, you'd have no problem with it because you have no idea that's a garbage can behind it. No one would tell. And then as soon as you get to the f32, that's how you know, oh yeah, there's a garbage can right behind it. Yeah, dumpster. Not the best for a nice water shot. Shutter speed. So shutter speed, as we were talking about before, is the way that the camera, or the speed at which the camera closes its shutter and how fast it's going to grab that image. So a 1 in 500, I always get this wrong with how to pronounce it. 5/100ths of a second. So that's what that first one is, 1 in 500. That means that within a second, then 5/100ths of that second, the shutter is going to close and then release. If you have someone in motion, which like I said, 1 in 1,000 is the best one to be at if you have someone working in motion. But if you have a light jogger, maybe you have your dogs are playing and you want to get something where they're wrestling, you want to get the clarity of that image, that's where you'd want to turn up that speed on the shutter so that way you get all of that in motion without it being blurred. If you want detail, you want a nice clear photo and you have no movement in there, that's where you'd want the lower number for your shutter speed because your shutter can open and close. We talked a little bit also last week about the bulb setting B, which sometimes you'll see on the dial. Bulb is nice because it keeps the shutter open until you click that button to close it. That was an example that I used for fireworks photos. You'll see a lot of people take photos of the fireworks during the holidays, and what they'll do is they'll set their camera on a tripod, use the bulb feature, keep it open the whole time, and the fireworks will continuously fire off. The camera will pick up on all of those, and you'll see streams of color as it goes through, and it's a really nice photo.
B, huh?
B.
Remind me later to ask for that. I don't see a B.
Well, you might not. Some cameras don't have them anymore. I've noticed them on the older ones. They still have B, but I haven't seen them on a menu at all of any of the new ones. So a great example, freezing action, 1 in 1,000ths or faster. Again, it's a touch and feel subject with the camera. I was explaining the other day that a lot of the times with the cameras, if you're using auto, it's really nice because the camera itself will actually, if you open up the image on the camera and you use the playback button, if you keep pressing on the playback button, it'll usually give you more specs about the camera. It'll tell you how the photo was taken. That's what we were doing last time. Yes. And that's nice because they give you a little diagram too to show you on there.
What should it, just a normal picture? Should keep it around 400?
I would say, well, a 400 is still going to be a little bit fast. 1 and 1/25ths, I would say, is a good one.
Just said last week.
If you go a little higher than that, I think that's fine as well too. Typically, when I'm shooting, if I'm not doing a lot of motion, I'm anywhere between the 1 and 1/25ths, or I sometimes go to 1/500ths, but the 1 and 250. That's probably the other one that I'm at in between the most. My ISO I typically keep at about 800 because I like the graininess of a photo. And then I'm a big controller of my f-stop. I like having background and foreground together. I really don't have a lot of the times where I blur the two, but that's my personal preference on it. Cameras in general, the way that we control them, it's all touch and feel. So it's important when you're playing with this. I always like to take multiple photos in as many speeds or f-stops or variations as I can, because you never know what's really going to click and get the best color and image for it. You can sit there and get much better at this, practice, and really have an eye for photography as far as what numbers you believe you should be using. But switching it just slightly could change the color, could change the contrast, could make the subject a little bit more brighter or appear in that foreground better. And that's all stuff that you'll learn as you keep taking photos and as you find where your comfortability lies with it. So giving more sense of motion. So this is another example for a hummingbird.
That's incredible.
I can't imagine this was done in a 1/1000th. I feel like that was wouldn't be fast enough. This is definitely done in a little bit faster of a speed, if anybody who's familiar with the birds knows. There's some really cool videos online I've seen of capturing birds in motion, and the videos are moving at the perfect frame rate for the birds to be seen, where it almost looks like the birds are hovering. They don't look like they're moving their arms or their wings at all. But then when they slow the frame rates down, then you really just see the blur of the wings. So that sense of motion, there's a slight blurring on the bird's wings, so you know they didn't capture him in perfect stillness, but you can see the clarity of the bird and the beak, and then as you're moving down in the feathering, as you get closer to the tail, you can see how rich the yellow is, how saturated the color is, but then number two, how blurred the wings are on the edges and then into the background of the photo. So aperture priority in this one, definitely kept at a lower number. I'd probably say between 3.6 and 2.8 depending on the camera. And then as far as speed goes, this is definitely going to be a higher ISO than 1000. Maybe 2500. I don't know if that might feel still a little slow, but I'd say around over 1000 for sure.
Shoot at 4,000.
Yeah, exactly. Jack it all the way up, as high as it goes. And then that also moves into creating modes with long exposures. So I was talking about those firework photos. A waterfall is another great example. You can see this light flaring on the water, where the water gets hazy almost as it goes up. It can almost feel like a light precipitation is coming off of the water, and the green of the nature looks beautiful, but you can see the motion slightly in the foliage in the top left corner. That green looks a little oversaturated, but also looks a little blurry. This photo definitely would have been taken on a tripod, definitely would have been kept with a very long exposure. So one of the things that, if they got rid of the B on the dial, if you're in the manual control settings and you go into the control for the shutter speed, you should be able to turn that shutter speed all the way to the slowest setting, which should be the B. If it's not there, then we'll take a look again. But that bulb setting keeps it open the whole time, and something like this would have been done on that, where the artist set up the tripod, set the camera. In this case, they probably would have kept the f-stop at a higher number, possibly 22, or 32, possibly a little lower than that, just to get both the foreground and the background as crisp as they could. And then on top of that, the way the water is coming down, you can tell that there is motion to it, but the centers of this coming down feel much more crisp and clear, where as you get to the edge of the water, edge of that white, and that's where you can see like the ghost streaks or that slight kind of light seepage coming out of there. In my opinion, that would be where you're seeing more of the motion, and the center part is where it's being focused on. But long exposure photography can be very creative. It can give the viewer, the artist, a lot to play with. Fireworks, I know, are really popular with long exposure. This waterfall is a great example of it. I've even seen really cool long exposures with traffic. If you set up on the bridge of a highway and you set your camera down, cars that are moving back and forth, you get the stream of light that comes off the back of the tail lights or off of the headlights. And it has a really cool look to it. So playing with long exposure can have its benefits. Another great example of long exposure. So this would have been a train that's going past the subject. This would have been another one where the aperture is probably kept at a higher number because the background and the foreground are very crisp. The subject, the man in the red shirt, the bike, and the ceiling are not moving. Neither is the foreground, the floor. But if you look through, you can see the opposite side of the train tracks. And then you also see the train's lights and windows going past in the distance. Again, a long exposure that a long exposure. I was trying to think of something else to say on that. So why use shutter priority? I think this photo kind of tells all with this. If you are not using shutter priority or you're not using manual, this is a lot of the times what happens, and this is why people get frustrated with using using a camera versus using your cell phone. When you use a cell phone, it does all the work for you. It does that snapshot where it'll get that detail, get that information. When you're using a physical camera, you have the ability to control the shutter speed, control all of that. So this photo might be the first photo that you take with the camera. Change the shutter speed a little bit, take another photo, and then the gentleman throwing the frisbee is in a little bit more clarity, more detail.
You know, I was just messing around with your water fountain back there. This one here.
Yeah.
And I did what you said, and I put it at 800 and 3.5.
Yeah.
And this is a picture I got, which is pretty decent, right?
That's really nice.
Okay, but here's the interesting part.
Okay.
I listened to you. Wait here. I did it with auto too, and that's auto.
There you go. So auto can do a great job of getting the image, but auto at the same time it's great to start with. That's your beginning point using the automatic feature on the camera. It's going to give you a clean image or a crisp image. In your case, not so clean or crisp.
No,
but
probably because of the window.
Yeah, probably because of the window. But in the past images that you've shown me, they've been really nice. In the case of using the settings on there, you have the ability to dictate how you want the camera to capture that image. It penetrated through the window behind us. So the gentleman next to me, he took a picture of our fountain that's located in our atrium here. On auto, the photo itself was blurry, had some motion to it. You really couldn't see through the window of it. You can kind of see behind me how white the background looks already. He then set his aperture and his shutter speed accordingly to get the motion on the fountain a little bit more, and then to also get the fountain and the background of the fountain a little more in detail. And the photo was much more saturated with color. The window didn't necessarily give a haziness to it. And that's kind of the example between...
Shutter speed was 8,000.
And your shutter speed was 8,000.
Really?
That's a great example. Yeah. 1 in 8,000? Yeah, that's exactly, because you got an f-stop of 3.5, shutter
And
speed of 8,000.
3.5 that slow,
Mhm.
and then the shutter speed 8,000.
1,000 is the one I recommended for motion, but
In
8,000
this case, it worked
would work great for that.
because of the window.
Yeah. And the motion too with the fountain. It looks good. But that's a great way of looking at it. Auto will still take a good image, but sometimes auto fails. It's never foolproof.
Yeah.
Understanding how to use these controls, the shutter priority mode, that's a great example of it. Understanding how to use those helps in the field. If you're taking something and you're taking photos and you're going between all these different subject matters, using an automatic setting might be more appropriate for you. But if you're taking something in a very specific environment where you know that you're going to have to overcompensate something on the camera in order to get the best image possible, using those priority settings or using the full manual gives you the better control to take those images, to take better photos.
Thank you.
Another good example, so when we're talking about shutter priority, this could have been done in a 1/1000th. I mean, when they fly through the air on the motorbikes, I can't imagine they're going, the speed of a bird, shuttering its wings. I mean, they're moving fast, but you can definitely don't have to use the fastest of your shutter speed in order to get that guy.
So
Will the faster shutter speed give you the same clarity?
No. So the faster the shutter speed, now that's where the camera sensor, because again, you have to think about it. If I made you stare at something for a second and then close your eyes, and I made someone else stare at it for 2 seconds and then close their eyes, and I asked you what you saw in the best detail possible,
Well, that's a good example.
you probably wouldn't be able to tell me as much as the person who I let hold their eyes open for 2 seconds. And that's a small number, but then imagine if you were doing that for 5 seconds and a minute. The longer that you have it open, the more information the camera can pull in and suck in. The issue with doing that, though, is if there's a lot of motion, it blurs what your camera's seeing, because your camera is continuously keeping its sensor open, meaning everything that's happening in front of it, the camera's picking up. So that's why when we look at a photo like the waterfall,
That's a good explanation. I like that.
all of the foliage, the center of the water, and the rocks are perfect. Where you see the motion is the top left corner. You can see some of those are a little bit blurry, and that's probably because there was wind wherever this was happening. And you see the blurriness on the top of the water, the white haze that goes around it. That's water, but that's that splash coming from the water that can go in any different direction. That's not necessarily staying in the same motion. Same thing with this gentleman in front of the train. The train is completely in motion, so we're getting all of that quickness, that color, that everything else, but we're then getting the better detail on the ceiling, on the bike, on him from that longer exposure because they're still.
You know what I don't understand? Is that the guy's name on the train? Because that should be blurred, that hotel.
Well, so that's probably on the opposite side of the train.
Oh.
I think it's an
okay.
advertisement.
It's an advertisement probably for the hotel on the opposite side. So, because you can tell there's a sign underneath there too. What I imagine is that where those breaks in between the trains are,
Right.
that's where you could see it. And then on top of that too,
Oh.
with this photo, he most likely would have started this before the train, or whoever took this. They probably opened the long exposure before the train pulled up, and then it kept going until after the train finished.
Okay. That's interesting.
And because that sign didn't move, the camera's going to pick it up.
That might take a little bit of work to do.
Keep
Don't
playing with
move,
it.
don't move. I'm taking a picture,
Just,
don't move.
please don't move. Please, whatever you do.
But the longer exposure did it.
But the longer exposure would have, especially for those.
So what, that motorcycle, would 1,000 take care of that?
I honestly would say 1,000 would be a great starting point for that. I mean, thinking about it as like a hummingbird, when we were looking at the one image,
Hummingbird is a little more than 1,000.
it's definitely going to be a little higher, I would say, yeah, absolutely, because of the motion that it's coming at. When you have something that's moving in a good amount of motion, but it's not necessarily as fast. A hummingbird's wings are so fast when you watch them. You can't even see the way these birds flap their wings sometimes, especially the smaller ones. When you're looking at a human, even if you're running a marathon and you're getting pictures of marathon runners, a 1 in 1,000 is a great starting point. If you see any blur on that, or you still see motion, that's when you can turn the number up so that way you're getting the appropriate picture at the appropriate speed.
That's a good
If he is the photo editing tool, shows up what the speed was.
Say that again?
If he is the photo editing tool,
Mhm.
it shows what was the speed.
Yes, it does, exactly. And that's the other nice part about using auto, and that's what we were talking about last
Yeah.
week. If you're used to shooting in auto, and and you really want to start getting a better jump start into playing with these settings because you yourself want to be more experienced with your camera.
Yeah.
If you go into your old images that you shot on auto and you click the playback button a couple more times, it should tell you all of the information for how that camera set it in there. So if you you went out and you took all these beautiful photos at at the zoo, and you're going through and you're like, okay, well, those zebras were running in this photo. They're very clear here. What did I do? I shot it on auto. Clicking that playback button should then tell you that you shot it at this aperture, at this speed, at this f-stop, and this was your ISO. And it breaks it down and does it because the camera's doing all the work for you, and so it's recording the information for what it shot at. So definitely, if you're brand new and you're just getting into this, I think starting on auto and then playing with your settings, you get to understand it a little bit better, and that might be a good mental understanding too of, all right, well, that bird was moving that fast, and I got it crisp in this image. What were my settings? Oh, okay, I'll remember that for future when I have to do this again. And then ISO. So these 4 images are the same speed, shutter speed, and aperture, but it's different ISO. The lower the number, the darker the image appears, but the more saturated with color. There's that vignette coming around the sides of the 100 picture. The bridge is very dark. The water underneath the bridge is extremely dark, and that shadow from the foreground, which is not actually touching the sun at all, is dark too. Moving into 200 to 400, you can start seeing the beach of the sand warm up a little bit. It's starting to become lighter. The water itself is picking up more reflection, and it's becoming less dark towards the edges. And same thing around the whole thing. The vignette on the 100 is the darkest out of the bunch, and as you keep moving into the next, it starts to lighten up on the edges. Getting into that full 800, though, that's where it starts to get a lot more lighter. But by doing that, and this is the area I point out, if you look underneath the bridge of that photo, of the 800 one, you can see that the cross construction that's keeping those bridge stakes upwards, they start to blur out a little bit. They start to become a little bit lighter, whereas in some of the other ones they were darker. Out of the bunch, I would say the 200 and the 400 are probably my 2 favorite of the image. I think that the sunset looks nice. You get the cleanness of the water having a little bit more darkness and lightness, the better contrast between the two. And you can clearly make out the sandy beach. And I would say the 400 does the best of that if I was really picky, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the 200, just still a little dark. 800 starts to wash it out. You're getting beautiful colors, the saturation is nice, but you're losing that contrast between the dark and the light. So ISO is a great way to play with the light. It's a great way to understand your relationship as far as the camera's nighttime and daytime applications. Going into it a little more, if you're a DSLR or mirrorless, point and shoot, it's an okay ISO. I really, some point and shoots are going to have a really beautiful ISO, a really high number that you can play with, and a really low number that you can drop it down to. Mirrorless, in my experience, typically have a higher ISO range. They do better in these low light situations because they really can help lighten it up. Sony is a great example. I personally shoot with Fujifilm that has a really good light relationship. If you're using a DSLR, that's where light can get a little bit tricky. Typically DSLRs aren't the best for low light situations. That's where a lot of DSLRs, they're made with a pop-up flash for that exact reason, and mirrorless ones aren't anymore. You don't necessarily need a pop-up flash on a mirrorless, but most DSLRs will have a pop-up flash of some sort. And then ISO and noise. If you're taking an image and you're playing with the aperture and the f-stop and everything else, and you have a really nice photo, but maybe you want to, what's the best way to describe this? I like to think of this as a vintage feel for the photo. One of the things that ISO does as well is changes the noise of the photo, the graininess of the photo. So when you look at ISO 100, you can still see a little bit of grain on that photo. The lens probably wasn't necessarily a telephoto lens. It didn't have the most clarity to it. So you can see that believe, I actually don't know what building that was. I was going to say the Chrysler building, but I don't know if that's right. Regardless though, the left side of the building with the ISO 100 has a slight graininess to it. You still see blur on the building, but looking at the sky, you can definitely see there's not a lot of noise, not a lot of things happening. When we move to the right side of the image with the 3200 ISO, we see a lot of noise space, and it's mainly in the sky, but you still see it in the buildings. ISO, as it's battling the sun or as it's playing with the light, it's one thing it can do is it can cause graininess to the photo. Some people love it, that's what they want with a photo, because that gives it that certain feel. Like when I shoot personally, my ISO is always at 800. And I think the 800 with my settings that I have in my camera give me the most film-like picture I can get. I come from a background of film photography. That's where I started doing most of my work on, and so moving into a digital aspect, that was the one thing I wanted to keep, was how do you keep the quality and that kind of candidness and that warmth of film, but move it into a digital sense, which can feel a little bit more cold. ISO is a great way to play with that. Noise reduction, how to keep a clean image versus how to noisy it up and make it a little bit more vintage would be the best word I can use for it. That's all something that you can play with ISO. So ISO, it's important to remember, it's going to be the thing that controls your light, what gives the image more light, what shows more light through, builds contrast or takes away on contrast. But then ISO is also going to be what helps with noise and noise reduction. If you have something where you need less noise, the lower the ISO number, the less noise it creates. The higher the ISO number, the more noise it creates. And then that also helps go into when you're talking about your aperture and your shutter speed. The more noise that's there, it can be cleaned up depending on the aperture or the shutter speed. If the shutter speed is at a lower number, typically your ISO is also going to be at a less grainy version, even if it's a higher number. If your aperture is quick and you have a high ISO, that's where you're going to get more of a grainy photo. So it's important to keep those relationships in balance too, but that's all something that's touch and feel with the camera as you're using it. Auto ISO, when to use it. I typically tell most people to keep auto ISO on at all times until you really feel like you have a good comfortability over the aperture, the f-stop, and the shutter speed. If you can navigate those three confidently and you have no issues with them, moving into your ISO is then the next step. Auto ISO, places I would use it is if maybe you're coming, the zoo is one of my favorite examples because like the zoo, when I think of the zoo, I think of the fact that you're outside. It's like, I hope that's not me. I think of the zoo because sometimes you're outside, you're walking around, you see the animals, and then other times you go into these buildings to see the reptiles or to see the lions or to see very specific things. That in and out feature where you have the light constantly being a variable factor, that would be a great time to use the auto ISO. In that case, it's going to then determine, the camera has a built-in light meter, the camera's going to do all of that work for you, you don't need to focus on that.
Can you keep auto ISO on even though you're using any other?
Well, so if you're using your aperture, your shutter priority, then it should automatically, the ISO is going to continue to go no matter what. So you don't have to worry about the ISO. The camera should take care of the rest. If that's not the case, then it's a setting that you can change while you're under the aperture or shutter priority to have the ISO continuously. And program, exactly, so you can see that it's
But that's on auto.
Exactly. So then whatever settings, we would just have to change it so that way these two are on. We can take a look at that at the end.
Okay.
Same thing with program too. You can program the ISO to be automatic, where it's continuing.
The aperture and all the rest.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
But a good time to use auto ISO is if you are in a position where your light is varying. It's going to continuously change. Indoor settings, you're probably going to know what your light is the whole time. If you're shooting outdoors the whole time, you're going to know what your light is. If you're going in between those two, prom photos, maybe homecoming photos, you take photos outside of the couples, you take photos indoors of the couples, that might be a great time where you want to use auto ISO. If you're inside of a gymnasium and there's a sporting event going on, lights are changing in different constants, that might be a great time to use auto ISO, or that's one less thing that you need to focus on. But I still say, personally, use auto ISO on the camera until you fully feel comfortable with the other features, with the aperture, with the f-stop, and with your shutter speed.
Look at ISO as when you bought film, 100 and 200 was the clearest.
Yes.
1600 was the grainiest.
Yeah, but cheapest also with the 1600. And then we'll go another little review. Let me move on my end, my little guy out of the way. All right, that should do it for you. So we look at this guy, and this is where we get more information again. So reviewing on everything, we have the pigs on the top. The two piggies next to each other at f16 clearly show the pigs and the background and the couch. That is a good relationship between both your foreground and your background. As you start to lower that f-stop number, the piggies stay in full focus, but that background starts to go. And that's what aperture, or what f-stop is going to do for you. It's going to be a good balance between your foreground and your background, giving more clarity to one or both. Moving into your shutter speed, you can see at 1/1000ths with a hammer swing, you can clearly make it out. You still see a little bit of blur within the hand, but it's a still image. Jumping dramatically down to 125, 1 in 250, that's where you're going to see the hammer move. His hand, or the hand in general, is a little more clear. 1/60th, more blur, and then as you keep going down, it's almost unrecognizable what the actual item in his hand is, or if that's a hand at all. I would say after 1/8, it starts to become unrecognizable. And then we go into ISO. So ISO at 100, you get a nice coloration between the penny and that wood, or the finish of whatever the penny is on top of. But through that, as you keep going down the list, you get a little more less color on the penny. I would say the sweet spot right there is that 100. It's a beautiful beautiful shot, good color between the two. 400, you're starting to lose that color. The penny's starting to become more washed out. The black from the table underneath is starting to go, and you're getting into more grainy images as you keep going down the list. Again, depending on how much light you need to let in for the image, depending how dark your subject matter is, that's where ISO becomes more of an effect. Move this back up. Alright, exposure meter. So on all of the cameras, when you're looking at it either through the LCD screen or you're looking through the viewfinder on there, you're going to see an exposure meter. Some people turn theirs off, some people keep theirs on. For Canon, they show a 1, a 2. For Nikon, they show more of a dash in between their dots. Each of those numbers or dashes represents a stop. That's your the stop is referring to your f-stop and how that's relating to your physical light. So looking at this guy, we can see that there are different stopping points that you can go between, and your light meter will then tell you or direct you for how you need to adjust and conform that. You can keep it wherever you want, but those lines that are underneath the 0 and then what I consider home plate for Canon, that is the middle. That means it is taking an even light picture, and it's not going either too high or too low. Too high being the 1 plus 2, too low being the 1 negative 2. Full manual, control over both aperture and shutter speed. Just reiterating that point. Good example of full manual here. Coloration on the building is nice. You have good sense of ISO with this one, where the photo doesn't feel, actually looking at the photo now, if you look at the edges of the railing and you look at the metal of the bridge, you can see the graininess underneath those dark spots. They definitely turn the ISO up a little bit to counterbalance that. The darkness of the roof, the sky, and everything else, though, feels pretty good. So overall, this probably has a mid-range f-stop. The far background, as you get past those main buildings there, starts to get blurry. The foreground, being the bridge and then moving into the building slightly, those look pretty polished and cleaned. Let's see. ISO looks good. Shutter speed wise, I probably would say this is a slower number, or a slower shutter speed, just looking at it right now. If you were to do it this fast, I don't think you'd get the complexity in the light, especially coming from the windows. You can see there's a lot of light coming from some of those windows. They're very bright. So
Think you used a tripod?
I would assume so, yeah, for this one.
And the lights that are lit up are really
Those are bright.
bright.
Yeah. So I imagine it's a longer exposure. You have higher ISO on this one to compensate for the darkness of the area. That also then helps that white come through. And the reason I say the ISO is higher is because if you look at those pillars, you do see some graininess up there. And then the f-stop. The foreground is in focus, the bridge, and then as you move into the buildings, you can still see the brickage and everything else. But this would be a great example of full manual, where you're really taking control over the entire camera and really deciding what you want to do with this photo.
What did you say the f-stop would be?
I would say middle. If 32 is the highest and 1.4 is the lowest, I probably would put this at a 12, maybe a little higher than that. Because the background's still pretty clear, but the background's clouds, so I can't really make out whether they're blurry or not. The thing I'm looking at the most is that glass building behind the bricking. There's that one building right there. It looks like a tree. It's blurry. It's a little harder to make out, but it's directly in the center where the vanishing point is to the left. All of that looks pretty blurry, so that's where I imagine that it's more of a focus on the foreground, less of a focus on the background.
You lose it on the brick on the floor below where the cars parked if you keep on falling out.
Yeah, you can see that detail. Yeah, and as it keeps moving outwards, yeah. So definitely, I would say that this is more of a blurred background so it would definitely be middle, I would say 10, 11, or 10, 12, as far as your f-stop. Another good example, we've got our flowers here. This would be a better example of having an f-stop that's lower. So maybe a 1.4, but you can still make out that background. So I don't think it'd be that low. Probably 3.6, enough where you know that that's more branches in the back, but you see the clarity and everything else of the physical flowers. ISO, it looks like the ISO is going to be kept super low on this one. A lot of light when you're outside, so a lot of light hitting the flowers, not a lot that you need to manipulate there. And other than that, I mean, shutter speed doesn't need to be fast on this.
Something like this, you don't auto,
No.
You can't get that with auto.
No.
You can't get that with a phone, right?
No, exactly.
Good.
Can't get that.
We'll
Yeah,
work
you
on it.
can.
Regret.
I'll show you.
Well, cameras are better. Gotta get away from the phones. That's the goal.
The phone's always with me. This, not so much.
I know. That's why I have a camera that my lens on my camera is a 35 millimeter, and it's for me. There's a little distortion because of the size, and actually we should keep moving on that before I talk more. But yeah, back to it. And there's another good example. So now we have a portrait of a person. Coloration on the jacket, on everything else looks good. So ISO is at a pretty good range, not overbearing, maybe a little closer to 800. There's a little bit of chatter I see on like his collar and on his physical shoulders. But the f-stop as a whole is probably going to be a little lower, probably not quite 3, maybe a little higher than that, just to make up for the fact that you can see the gentleman in the background, but you can't make up any of his facial details.
That's cool.
Exposure-wise, it's probably not a long exposure. Color looks good though, so full manual. Another good example.
That's what I want to do.
Good detail on the foreground there. Background though, you can still make out the background though. So definitely not too low of an not too low of an aperture at all. No. Really, I don't see any type of graininess or texturedness. So I'd imagine that the ISO is pretty low as well too. Shutter speed, it's probably not moving at any fast speeds, so you probably don't need to worry about changing that up too much either. Or doing anything too crazy with the shutter speed, I should say. Capturing the image at a faster rate as opposed to a slower rate. Slower in this case would give more detail, and that's why we see so much detail in the horn, the fur. The camera's able to pick up much more information.
Yeah, that's what I got to do with my dog.
And then in motion.
Yeah, I've got to get. I tried it. I failed.
Background's a little blurry, so you definitely are looking at something that has a lower aperture for sure. Maybe a 1, especially for the dog on the left there. Definitely probably a 1.4 or a 2.8. Maybe for the other one you're a little higher than that. But again, the foreground and the subject are what's really in detail. The background, you start to lose it, especially with that one dog with the white frisbee. As far as the shutter speed for this one, you're probably looking at 1,000. I'd imagine a little higher than that, probably. I mean, think about it. He's in motion, but once he gets up in the air, it's not like a bird or anything else where those appendages are flying everywhere. They're holding themselves rigid when dogs go up in the air like that. So 1,000 could be a good way to do it, maybe a little higher than that, but I probably would start at 1,000. Especially in your case if this is something that you're trying to get with the images. And then same idea, football player diving into the end zone, they're moving at a good speed. You're definitely going to want to use a faster shutter speed for that. Not a lot of noise, so ISO is probably kept at a low number, light's good outside. And then as far as f-stop is concerned, the background's blurry, but not nearly as blurry, so keeping it closer to that, not necessarily 32, maybe a 22, that would give you that. A lot of examples in these last couple slides, and then we'll move into, yes. Learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. It always comes down to the practicality of it. You gotta get out there, you gotta take photos, you gotta play with all the stuff. I could sit here and talk about it till I'm blue in the face. We can try to investigate these photos and figure it out. But the biggest thing with any camera is not only to read, learn about it, but to physically go out there and take as many photos as you can. Study your photos after you take them. Use that playback feature to really go through and see what the settings you liked, what you didn't like. And that helps give a better comfortability towards the camera. Wow. And then more accessories to use. Practice, classes, YouTube channels, I love those. Different workshops like here, other places offer awesome workshops as groups where they actually go into the field, take a bunch of photos, and talk about it. I know you had mentioned something about that not long ago with I believe the gardens, the botanic. You had the class, or not the class, but the group that you were working with. Yeah, they're all out there. And then traveling. I'm a big travel photographer. Every time I go to somewhere new, my camera's always with me. And whether or not I take 1,000,000 photos or I take 10. It's really fun to look back and see what settings, what I did to get the best photo. Some more recommended accessories. I know we talked about these before. Definitely always recommend a bag, extra battery and memory card, some form of cleaning kit for the lens, especially if you're taking photos outside a lot. You can get a lot of gunk on the lens. So having a filter too is a really nice thing on the lens, the polarizer ND filters. Great ways to, number one, protect the lens, but then also reduce any glares or anything like that. Additional lenses, which we'll talk about in just a moment, external hard drives, all stuff that we talked in the very basics beginner class. Date your body, marry your glass. I had a customer in the store today who came in with a older EOS Rebel model, and they loved their lenses, but they didn't know what the next step was. Their camera body was 15 years old. I was like, keep the glass. Glass is fine. Get a new camera body. I usually recommend every 10 years or so, get a different camera body, upgrade your camera body. The cameras get faster. These guys start to slow down after years of use.
I heard they're going to start manufacturing, right? DSLR?
Well, I said,
They're going to start manufacturing DSLR.
yeah. Yeah. I don't know how much information's out there about it now. I know Nikon is discontinued. They discontinued 2 of them. They discontinued 2 of their more intro-level DSLRs. I think the D500 and the D70, or no, I know D7500. I can't remember if it was the
What about
D500.
the D7200?
That one's no longer, they don't make that guy anymore. They upgraded to the 7500, now they no longer make the 7500. Yeah, it might be time. But
Well,
they
you
are,
gotta know how to use it.
they're slowly getting away from DSLRs. They're clunkier, they weigh a lot more. As far as light is concerned, you're gonna get more detail coming from a mirrorless camera, slightly. But the thing is, and I will say this, the DSLR is the first modern camera. It's the first thing that replaced the simple film cameras. I shouldn't even say simple, because those things, if you didn't load them right, you were donezo. All your film was gone. But the DSLR was the next step from the SLR, and I think for the next 20 years, 25 years, we're still going to see DSLRs being serviced, lenses still being made, accessories being manufactured, classes on them. The DSLRs aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Manufacturer-wise, though, they're going to start slowing down on the making of them to start making the new stuff. Does that mean your camera's outdated? Absolutely not.
Well, I think if I learn how to use this camera, then I can think about doing the other one.
100%. 100%. But on that same note of glass, we should talk about focal length and zoom, and I know I'm going over a little bit, so I'll answer questions as late as you guys have them for me, so I do apologize. There's a lot jam-packed into this. Focal length, zoom, looking at this, starting at 70 millimeters and then going all the way up to 400, the biggest thing is that focal length for photographers relates to zoom. Focal length in this sense really changes the still in front of you. Depending on the glass, they have different f-stops. If you have a lens that has a variable f-stop, you have something that might go from f-stop of 4.0 to an f-stop of 6. And what that basically means is that starting at a 70, it's going to be 4. And as you start moving into that 400 range, it's going to continuously raise the lowest f-stop that you can do. And that just means less detail with the photo. The higher the f-stop, the less you can focus in on just getting the subject matter by itself, and you're going to get more of that background included with it. But with that being said, you're going to get more zoom with it, which means if you are a wildlife photographer and you can't necessarily get close to subject matter, or maybe you take pictures of your son's baseball or basketball games and you want to zoom in further from the sidelines, having more focal length, while it might reduce what your f-stop is, it's going to give you closer distance or more distance to get to the subject matter. I like this little, I don't know if it's a GIF or a GIF. I always get into arguments with people about this one. I'm going to say it's GIF because that's what the guy said it was called who made them. You can see with this is the same kid that they're taking pictures of in each of these photos, but there's different focal lengths with each of them. The more distorted one is going to be directly in the middle, and that's the 50. This moves at a pretty fast rate, so you can't see it. 50 millimeters in a subject matter typically provides the least amount of distortion. 70 as well, 100 would be a good example. But as you can see, as you're getting closer to that 135, 200, his face starts to plump up a little bit and he becomes a little bit more chunkier in the face. And then as obviously you go into the smaller numbers, you're going to get more of a narrow head on him. His eyes kind of bug out a little bit and the glasses don't fit right. Again, it's all based on the focal length and the compression of which that's going to do. I call it distortion. Compression works as well. What lenses do you need? The kit lens. It's your first lens that's going to come within your camera. You're probably going to get something in the ballpark of wide angle to portrait. So 18 to 55 is a really popular one. I've seen 18 to 70, 18 to 75 on some of these guys. Wide angle is about that 18 mark. 18 to, I've seen super wide angles all the way down to 12, and I've seen them go all the way to 24 when they stop marketing them as wide angles. So I'd say that 12 to 24 range is a good spot. I typically think 18 to 16 is more of the juicy spot for the wide angle. Get to 12, you're going to get a lot more distortion on there. 18-16. You really don't get any distortion with it. 3.5 to 5.6 on the f-stop for this guy. So that basically means starting at 18 millimeters, you're going to get a 3.5 f-stop. That's the lowest number it can go as far as f-stop's detail is concerned. As you start getting closer to that 55 range, you're going to get to that 5.6. And again, it's just going to change your f-stop up, which is going to change the relationship that your lens can have between foreground and background. We'll talk about that at the end. I'll tell you exactly what those mean. Nifty 50. 50 millimeter lens. So as I was talking about when we were looking at that GIF of that boy and seeing the different millimeter sizes and how that compresses and distorts the face, the 50 millimeter lens is basically the prime lens for whatever you're using. I have a Sony lens on this case, and it's a G Master series, so one of their high-end, best glass lenses. This is a great example of a lens that's going to give you perfect portrait, no real distortion on there, and really give a good image to the subject matter. Perfect for portraits, perfect for walking around if you're not looking for any zoom, if you just want clean images of both background, foreground, or you want to set. But typically if you have a 50 millimeter lens or you have one of these nifty 50s, as I like to call them, they typically have a low f-stop if you choose to get one. The higher the f-stop number, typically the cheaper the lenses are in a lot of the cases with manufacturers, depending on the quality. The lower that f-stop number, the more expensive the lens can get. I always say if you're going to get yourself a prime lens, whatever money you can put towards a prime lens, look for the lowest aperture possible. You'll thank me.
But the young lens is very expensive, right? Actually.
Yeah,
Is it worth?
I mean, I would say yeah, depending on, again, looking at it with the f-stop. That f-stop's everything as far as the camera's concerned. It's kind of like your nitty gritty. That's your iris on there that really differentiates the background and the foreground. The lower that number, the better control you have over that. And that's the biggest thing. I mean, if you're an everyday walking around photographer and you just want to get good images of the family, maybe the kids, the dogs, whatever it is, you probably don't need to worry about getting something with a crazy aperture on there. But if you're someone who wants to become semi-professional or more professional with it, and you want to have the cleanest.
Like the wedding pictures, then
Yeah. Prime lens versus zoom lens, pretty self-explanatory. Prime lens stays in one focal length. You do not change it. You cannot change it. You have a focusing meter on there, or you have auto to manual focus on it, depending if it has a motor built in. Zoom lens, you're going to get that focal length, so it's going to go anywhere between. They could do a super telephoto, which could be 100 to 600, 100 to 400 I've seen. You could also get something that is a all-in-one lens, but that's still technically a zoom that goes from 18 to 200 or 18 to 55. That technically is a telephoto lens, not a zoom lens, but it moves. But the big difference is the movement in the glass, what the focal length is and how many feet in between you and the subject matter you get. And then the trinity is the last slide, I believe. So the trinity of lenses is going to be kind of where each lens picks off. So 16 to 35, that is your wide angle, everyday walking around lens. 16 is going to take your wide angle, 35 is going to get you into that semi-portrait street photography. Bumping from there, you're going to move over to the 55 to 70, or sorry, yeah, that'd be a 55 to 70 there. That's Sony Zeiss. That is a great example of something that's going to do more portrait. You're walking around, you don't necessarily care about getting a building, you want to focus on taking pictures of everybody walking on the street, maybe some cars that are driving past you, objects. That's going to be a great lens because it's really just going to focus on that one thing. It's not going to give you the zoom that you need to push past, but it's going to give you good focus on the subject in front of you. And then lastly, the telephotos. That one in particular picks up at 70 and goes to 200. But that's a great example of a lens that picks up from the portrait, and now it's going to give you the zoom. So if you're out taking wildlife photography, you probably don't necessarily need that 16 to 35. It's going to be too general. It's not going to be specific enough for you to zoom in and really get a clean image. maybe carrying the 55 to 70 and the 70 to 200, or if you just want to carry one, it's heavy, but the 70 to 200, that'll give you all the zoom that you need, give you the portrait at 70 that you want, but then really push you towards being able to see things further away. And then a travel lens. I was talking about an all-in-one earlier. Having a lens that basically can give you wide angle, portrait, and a semi-telephoto, that should be the lens that you're taking with you if you have to take the big safari trip to Africa and you don't have a lot of space to travel with your camera, your lenses, your gear. If you're someone too that has neck problems or back problems, carrying a giant lens probably isn't the most practical thing. Having something like this, while the f-stop might not be at the most sharp or the lowest it can be, it might be better to carry this around than lugging around an extra 10-pound lens. 18 to 105 is the size of this lens. Alright, sorry, 18 to 135 is what the lens says. But you can find a lot of different lenses in the same kind of category.
So a single 100 versus this telephoto, what's the quality of the pictures or the quality?
It depends. If you're using a prime 100 lens, it probably has a lower f-stop number, maybe a 2.8, 1.4, or yeah, 1.8, 2.8. It has a consistent number though, so that f-stop will never change. So you have more control over that lens, but you only have one focal length. So depending on what you're taking pictures of, you have to physically move your body to get closer or further away. Having something like this, you have the ability, let's say that if you're standing here and you want to take a picture of something across the room, you don't necessarily need to pick your whole body up and walk towards that. If you want a lower f-stop, yes, 3.5 is where this thing is the lowest, 18, but then when we looked at it again, you're using an 18 millimeter lens, there's more distortion with that, less with 100. So it's a give and take with them. It really depends on what you're trying to take a photo of. That, I would say, is what really should make the difference for this. If you're out and about, 18 to 105 or 135, great. If you are in your garden or in a garden of some sort, you're not trying to get zoomed out photos or landscape photos and you just want the most detail, that's why I probably would carry the 100 with me. And that's the last slide I have. So anybody on the YouTube page, by all means, you may start chatting in the comments, ask me questions, I'll keep answering them. Our next class is going to be in 2 weeks from now, the last Thursday of this month. Let me check what day that's going to be. So yeah, the last class of this month is going to be the 28th. That'll be GoPro and action cameras. We'll go over all the different stuff that you need to know about those guys. In the meantime, please comment and ask me questions on here. I'm going to ask these guys in my class if they need any assistance with anything, and then we'll end the stream when everybody's jumped off. But let me know if you guys have any questions. Please sound off in the chat.
What's the link for the online class? Do you know?
I know it's on our YouTube. I honestly,
it's on YouTube?
It's right on the YouTube. So if you go to Apple Electronics on YouTube, you should see it. And I believe the way that it goes is you subscribe or you like the page, and then they send you a notification right when I'm starting. Because as soon as I start, if you were to like log on and then look, it should automatically be, oh, they're hosting a live, and you can just click on it. Exactly. What questions anybody got for me? I know I went through a lot today. This was definitely not like the last time. The last one was very basic when we first went for basic cameras. But I hope that helps and gives more information. I feel like there's a lot to take in.
So what's the best time to buy a lens? Black Friday or the best time to get the tea?
You know, it changes all the time. I will say that during the Christmas time holidays is pretty good. Sony likes to do some really nice sales in that time period. It's hit or miss. Right now the camera market is so rough as a buyer and as a seller because I have cameras that I've had on order for a year that I still haven't received yet. And then I have some, there's a lot. And I have, today I had a customer who came in who was looking at the EOS 6D Mark II. Great mirrored camera, DSLR from Canon. It's full frame. We put an order in the system back in May, and that's the last time I received the camera. It was back in May. So we're waiting.
Chip shortage.
Yeah, chip shortage. It's also manufacturing problems.
Supply and demand.
Yeah, supply and demand, but it's also how they're manufacturing them. Like I look at Leica, for example. If I remember correctly, Leica has one factory. And when Leica wants to build their cameras, what they do is they have to shut the whole factory down for a month, refit the entire equipment on the line to then be made so they can specifically make one style of camera. And a lot of the Leica stuff is made by hand too, which also adds to the whole thing. You look at somebody like Nikon, Sony, or Canon, they have multiple factories across the world where they're manufacturing these. All of those factories build 1 to 2 very specific types of cameras. They shut down the line for 2-3 weeks to then prep for the next camera to be built. So for like Sony, you go in, the one factory is probably building the 6400, the 6600, and the 6100. They have to shut down in between making each of those cameras. And then on top of that, you think of how many stores in the country and in the world are selling these cameras. Apt Electronics being one store out of all of those stores. It's how or when it's when we're going to get everything. But yeah.
Well, I got this at Costco, and Costco doesn't sell cameras anymore.
Yeah, I did hear about that.
Yeah.
A lot of people come in, they're very impressed with the collection that we have here and what we have to offer. We're not necessarily a cameras-oriented store. We have multiple electronics and appliances, but we do pride ourselves on having a staff that is pretty knowledgeable as far as the cameras are concerned, can get you through the basics, and then we offer things like this where we can kind of go into a little more detail and break things down.
Really nice.
Yeah.
Now, I notice everybody has a different camera here. I have the Nikon, you have a Sony, I think you had a Canon.
Also, yeah.
Yeah.
Canon. Is there really any difference?
Yes and no.
That's a tough question.
Yeah, it is a tough. And it's funny enough because I use Fuji, and that's a completely different brand all on its own. I don't own a single camera. Like this is the camera we use for the department when we're trying to teach is our Sony camera. I don't really have a preference on the brands. I think the biggest thing is you got to do what's comfortable to you. Every camera body has a different feel to it. You look at a Nikon camera, they're a little bit bulkier, they have that nice rounded edge, a better grip. They're a little heavier in general, I would say, than Nikons. But the quality of a Nikon is wonderful. Canon, same kind of boat. Their glass from their lenses really never ages. Those lenses are phenomenal on Canon cameras. Once you learn the operating system on one Canon, you've basically learned them all. It's pretty transferable as you go. I know Nikon's going from their D series to their Z series can be a little bit tricky from what I've heard from customers. Having the new Canon series where you have the R, because you have the R series, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The sensor on there is larger. It picks up a lot of information. Honestly, I don't think there really is too big of a difference between them. I think people have to go with the preference they're the most comfortable with. I have a lot of people who come in who love the fact that Nikon or Sony's been only making mirrorless for the entire beginning. They trust it. A lot of the video technology inside the Sony is the same thing that you're going to see in their movie cameras and in their higher end cameras. It's just downsized to be smaller for this. Nikon, you're going to get some of the best photos I've ever seen. Canon, you're going to get some really clean, really great color on Canon. I love the color on Canon.
The picture quality is
Yes, the color is awesome. And for me, the Fuji, what sold me on it was the viewfinder. I wanted a camera that had a rangefinder that you could see through. My rangefinder, I can actually, when I look through, I can shoot the image just what the rangefinder shows me, or I can toggle to digital. And for me, that's how I first learned how to shoot, so that's how I feel the most comfortable. It's true. But, well, no, there's no lens. It has mine, so yours goes through the lens.
Right.
Mine does not. Mine actually, the rangefinder is completely separate on the side of the camera. But I can toggle into the digital mode if I wanted to. I say whatever feels the best in your hand is the way to go with the cameras. I will say Nikon does have really nice auto tracking features with their subjects. So like if you have the Nikon camera out, the eye detection on the newer Nikons works for both humans and animals. And that's a huge selling point that Nikon loves to throw out, is that if you're taking photos of wildlife or animals,
Yeah.
they actually can detect the eyes on the animals the same way it detects the humans.
That's why those pictures I have were so good.
Yeah. So, again, it's kind of finding what you like about the camera specifically, but I still say what feels best in your hand. Anything else? I know I kept you guys a lot later than
No.
normal. We
How do you
really
get
didn't
a
get to
moon
do it.
picture?
Say that one more time.
How do you get the moon picture?
Gotta have the right lens for it. The moon pictures.
Is that big enough for you?
That's a pretty big lens. What's the f-stop? 2.8. That should do it.
Oh, I have that one too.
I was gonna say, have you tried taking any moon
More
shots?
than 2 days ago.
Trouble is, it's heavy.
I think you put it on a
Try it,
tripod.
because that's a good f-stop. So you got what, 2.8 on there? Is that what the f-stop is? That's a low f-stop. That should be open up real well. I would keep that open. I would do long exposure, and I would do low ISO on there. Let the moon be the main source of light. And keep it on a tripod. I guarantee you'll get a good crisp image. You got a good sensor on there. Lens cap you may or may not need for that one, or the lens flare cap.
I could never get this thing to stand.
It's a twist.
I know it
All
goes
right.
the other way.
Here, I'm going to end the video on this. Everybody online, have a great night. I will see you guys in 2 weeks. If you have any questions, just give a call to the store, ask for Sax, and I can answer any questions on cameras that you might have. If not, talk to anyone in the small electronics department. We're all very knowledgeable on cameras and can guide you to the right choice. Have a great night, be safe, and I'll talk to you everyone.